This call is from the Department of Social Security Administration. The reason you have received this phone call from our department is to inform you that we just suspend your Social Security number because we found some suspicious activity. So if you want to know about this case, just press 1. Thank you.
Millions have received this scary phone call. If you should get it, beware. Scammers are more prevalent than ever before in this information age. They're also craftier, and their favorite targets are people over the age of 50. So how can you protect yourself? It's that time again, time to tune out the hype and focus on the facts. Facts that matter to you, the income generation. Let's get started. Get ready to separate reality from myth.
With us, David Scranton.
David Scranton.
David Scranton.
David Scranton.
But David Scranton says, hey, not so fast.
How does it affect the markets? How does it affect the economy? Thanks to efficiencies in new technology and a staff of veteran analysts and portfolio managers, Sound Income Strategies strives to set new standards and bring institutional style investing to your portfolio. Last year, the National Council of Aging listed scam calls related to Social Security as among 3 frauds targeting seniors that raised the greatest concern. Meanwhile, the Federal Trade Commission has described the number of Social Security scam calls and their financial impact as, quote, growing exponentially, close quote. Since virtually all older Americans receive Social Security benefits, it's hardly surprising that many scam artists use Social Security as a ploy in fraudulent phone calls, fraudulent texts, emails, and letters. These schemes typically involve criminals impersonating the Social Security Administration in order to obtain and then misuse Social Security numbers and other personal information. These are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to scams targeting older Americans, making this issue one of the greatest financial threats people face in their retirement years. While we've addressed this important topic previously on the show, in the wake of the recent surge in scam calls and crimes, we're going to revisit it today and share some important tips about how to protect yourself. Joining me will be author and tax litigation consultant Dan Pilla, along with Jeff Johnson, the AARP Florida State Director. And Michael Eastham will also join us. He's an Amazon best-selling author and founder of Fellowship Financial Group, a retirement income store just outside of Orlando, Florida. And once again this week, we're also giving you the opportunity to join the conversation. At any point during today's show, you can submit your questions or your comments on today's topic or any financial planning issue via phone call or email. Then we'll respond to your input later in the show. Before we talk to our first guest, let's take a closer look at the recent upsurge in Social Security scams targeting older Americans. Let's look at what's being done about it and what you need to know to avoid becoming a victim. The scam call you just heard at the top of the show is just one example of the different ways in which Social Security scammers reel in their victims. But typically, these scams do have many things in common. Using robocalls or live callers, scammers pretend to be government employees and claim there is an identity theft or another problem with your Social Security number, a problem with your account, or some type of benefit. They may threaten you with arrest or other legal action, or they may offer to increase benefits, protect assets, or resolve that identity theft. They frequently demand payment for these services by retail gift card, cash, wire transfer, internet currency such as Bitcoin, or prepaid debit card. And oftentimes, the phone calls are just the beginning. The Inspector General of Social Security warns that phone scammers may also send fake documents by email or regular mail, for that matter, to convince victims to comply with their demands. The Inspector General's office reports that increasingly, victims have received emails with attached letters and attached documents that actually appear to be from the Social Security Administration. In fact, they often include official SSA letterhead and government jargon to convince individuals that they're legitimate. Now, another type of scam call attempts to sell to the victim services the Social Security Administration willingly provides free of charge. The caller might, for example, offer to provide a new Social Security card, or enroll a new family member in the program, or provide a record of your Social Security contributions to date, along with the expected future income that they might yield. As noted, in 2019 and into 2020, the Social Security Administration, FTC, and local law enforcement officials have all reported a significant increase in reports of Social Security scams. So with that in mind, they urge potential victims to be vigilant against scammers, no matter what type of proof these people claim to offer. Be aware that the Social Security Administration will never do any of the following things. They will never threaten you with arrest or other legal action. They will never promise a benefit increase or other service in exchange for payment. They will never request payment by gift card, cash, wire transfer, internet currency, or debit card. And they will never send official letters or reports containing personally identifiable information via email. If there's ever a problem with your Social Security number or your Social Security record, in most cases, the Social Security Administration will mail you a letter. And if you need to submit payments, the agency will send a letter with instructions and with payment options. Coming up in just a bit, we'll share some other tips on how to protect yourself from Social Security scammers. And later we'll discuss some other types of common scams that you need to be aware of. Right now, let's welcome our first guest, Dan Pilla. He's tax litigation consultant with experience in IRS procedure, and he's also an advocate of taxpayer rights. He's also the author of 15 books, including his newest book, which is now out, Small Business Tax Date. Dan, thanks for being here with us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dave.
So, we talked today about Social Security scammers that are out there. What are some of the most common scams that you're seeing today, especially when initiated over the telephone?
Yeah, well, the telephone scams are the so-called impersonation scams, Dave. And these, what happens is people get a phone call from somebody pretending to be from the IRS or from the Department of Treasury. They make up names. I mean, the syntax is all messed up when you're talking to these people. They'll say things like, Bureau of Internal Treasury or something like that. And it's obviously wrong. But what happens is these calls are very intimidating, very threatening. And the caller will say, listen, you owe, let's say $5,000 in taxes. And if you don't pay those taxes today, we're going to send somebody out to arrest you. Well, and so people get afraid, they get intimidated. The caller asks for a credit card or a debit card to pay the tax with, usually a debit card. Sometimes it's even more bizarre than that. Sometimes they'll ask for gift cards of some kind, Amazon gift cards or things like that to pay the tax, which is should be a red flag to anybody because, of course, the IRS is not going to take gift cards as payment for taxes, right? That's not going to happen. But these calls are very intimidating. There's tens of thousands of these calls that go out regularly, and so people need to be on the alert for them. Anytime you get a call from somebody pretending to be from the government that says if you don't pay taxes today, they're going to arrest you today, that's just an absolute guaranteed fraud.
So basically, best advice, 30 seconds left, if it doesn't pass the sniff test, better off getting a phone number, calling them back. What do you best advise?
Well, no, I wouldn't even do that, Dave. What I would do is I'd say, look, if you think I owe you money, send me a notice in writing and let me look at the notice and I'll respond. And they're just going to go away.
All right, Dan, we'd like to have you back for one more segment, so please don't go away. And you stay with us too. We'll be right back with more coming up in a minute, right after the break. When it comes to the recent flood of Social Security scam calls and scam mailings, consumer protection agencies and the Social Security Administration recommend taking several steps to protect yourself. If you receive any phone call asking for your Social Security number or other personal information, your best bet is to hang up immediately. You may also want to consider adding the caller's phone number to a blocked call list to help prevent future calls. Next, be sure that all your personal information, including your Social Security card, is stored securely. And if you ever access Social Security information online, keep your password to yourself and change it often to minimize the likelihood of your account being hacked. As we already mentioned, you should never pay a government fee or a fine using gift cards, cash, internet currency, wire transfers, or debit cards. Scammers ask for payment this way because it makes the payment difficult to trace and to recover. Another good precaution is to check your credit reports on a regular basis to make sure no one has compromised your financial information. And finally, keep up to date with current Social Security scams so you'll easily recognize them. And if you suspect that you've been the victim of a scam or simply want to report Social Security fraudulent calls or a mail that you find suspicious, you can call your local authorities or the Office of the Inspector General hotline, or you can fill out a public fraud reporting form at the Social Security's website fraud page, or you can report the scam to the FTC's complaint website. Coming up, we'll talk to the AARP's Florida State Director and get some more tips on how you can protect yourself from scams. And later in the show, we'll answer some of your most common retirement questions. And let's bring back in Dan Pilla, tax litigation consultant and author of 15 books, including the brand spanking new Small Business Tax Date. So, Dan, I have to ask you a question.
Sure.
Is part of this that people almost expect to be harassed by the government today, and maybe they feel like this is just normal? Is that what's happening at all, do you think?
Well, I certainly think there's some of that. I think the biggest problem, though, is people are so afraid of the IRS that whenever they hear those initials IRS, they stop thinking and they go into a panic mode. And, that the head is not clear. I mean, we see this all the time with legitimate IRS correspondence where people are so afraid of their IRS problems or interacting with the IRS. Dave, they don't even open their mail. I mean, I can't tell you how many clients I've had that have walked into my office with a grocery bag full of unanswered letters or unopened, never mind unanswered, unopened envelopes from the IRS. And so we've got to go through all the envelopes to figure out exactly where they're at. So this fear and intimidation immobilizes people, and the scam callers and the scam emailers are taking advantage of the fact that people are afraid and they're ignorant. Here's the thing people need to understand. You've got rights when you're dealing with the IRS, and these rights are very, very important. And when we're talking about collection, one of the most critical rights that you have is a right to what's called a collection due process hearing. The IRS can't take a nickel's worth of your assets. Dave, they can't seize a postage stamp from you before they offer you an opportunity for these collection due process appeal rights. So if you're getting a phone call from someone pretending to be from the IRS, or you're getting an email from somebody pretending to be from the IRS, and you haven't had one of these final notice letters come to you, you absolutely do not owe any money to the IRS. It's that simple.
So 30 seconds. If someone does get scammed, in your experience, what's their best potential to get some of that money back?
Well, I don't know the potential of getting any of the money back, Dave, frankly, because most of these scams are based offshore. But if you think that somebody is trying to run a scam on you, or you have in fact been scammed, the best thing to do is report it to the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. If you go to the IRS's website, irs.gov, there's a link on there for the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, and they have a link on their site for reporting frauds and scams. And
so hopefully at bare minimum, you get to protect the next person from the same thing happening.
Right,
so Dan,
exactly right.
Dan, Thank you very much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Crimes of fraud can impact the financial security of families and individuals at any stage of life. But older Americans are more susceptible. Why? Because scammers know they're likely to provide a bigger payoff because they've had more time to accumulate assets. And that's why the state of Florida, with its high population of retirees, ranks at the top of the list nationally when it comes to scams and fraud. It's also why it's so important to be aware of potential scams as retirement approaches. Most of us want to believe that we're too smart and too savvy to ever fall victim to scammers. But the criminals who specialize in financial crimes are often very smart themselves. They know how to manipulate the system to give the appearance of credibility. We've already talked about Social Security scams and what to watch out for. But here are some of the other common types of scams used against retirees and near retirees. Investment scams. Everyone remembers Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme that bilked investors out of millions. Well, there are plenty more con artists just like him out there. And like Madoff, they may very well have the proper credentials and they may seem legit. But beware. Thoroughly research any agency or individual before working with them, and always remember the sage advice that your parents probably gave you. If it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. Next, telemarketing scams. As we've seen with the new wave of Social Security scams, the telephone seems to be the weapon of choice among scammers, and they deploy it in a wide variety of ways. According to statistics, baby boomers make twice as many purchases over the phone as the national average. Scammers take advantage of this with cold calls and telemarketing tactics and schemes that manage to fool millions of Americans each and every year. And with no face-to-face interaction and no paper trail, these types of scams can be very hard to trace. The bottom line here is that if you don't recognize the phone number or the content of the call seems even remotely suspicious, again, then just hang up. Other common types of scams targeting older Americans are Medicare and health insurance scams. Perpetrators may pose as Medicare reps to get you to give them your personal information, which again is gold to scam artists. Finally, be aware of homeowner and reverse mortgage scams. Scam artists are well aware that people of a certain age are more likely to own their home. And there are any number of schemes they might use to target an older homeowner looking to sell, refinance, or to make improvements. The best way to protect yourself is to be aware of these schemes, and again, to thoroughly research any firm or any individual that you expect to be doing business with. And never sign any contract or document without a legal review. We'll share more tips on how to protect your money against scams and against the uncertainties of today's financial markets coming up in just a bit. Financial experts have predicted that the next major recession could happen as early as this year. What would you do if it took half of your retirement savings with it? I'm David Scranton, founder of Sound Income Strategies. And there is a safer way, investing for income. By focusing primarily on non-stock market income-generating investments, you could significantly reduce the impacts of the next major recession. Visit the Retirement Income Store at soundincomestrategies.com to connect with an income specialist who can help you get started to an income-based retirement plan. Now it's time to welcome our next guest, Jeff Johnson, the AARP Florida State Director. He's worked with the AARP for 20 years and has been the State Director for the last 10 years. Jeff, it's good to finally meet you after all this time.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on the show.
Of course. This is an important topic. So since you see these things firsthand, they get reported to you and so on, tell us, what are some of the major types of scams that you see going on today, especially those that target your membership?
Sure. And what I would say is that they fall into three categories. So one are straight up money scams. Either you've won the lottery, or you've won a sweepstakes, or you have debt that they want to collect, or your credit card company calls to try to get your credit card information. You also see some investment scams on that side too. But then beyond that, it's everything under the sun. So we have romance scams, people who are 50 and over who go on online dating sites get scammed. You see grandparent scams where somebody calls and says, hey, it's your grandson, I'm overseas, wire me some money. And then you have government scams. And that's kind of the biggest area where the most common scamming takes place. People claiming to be Social Security, people claiming to be the IRS, and particularly this year, people claiming to be the U.S. Census Bureau.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked a little bit about the IRS and Social Security earlier in the show, as those seem to be the most common. But what are you seeing today with investment scams? When we think of investment scams, we always think of Bernie Madoff, right? Because that was one of the biggest. But those come up on a much more frequent basis. And I hate to say it because I live down here in Florida also, but Florida seems to be the hotbed of those. So can you give our viewers an idea of roughly how often you see an investment scam come on your radar somewhere here in our beloved state?
It's really common. So if you go to AARP's website, we have one specifically set up for fraud called the Fraud Watch Network. It's aarp.org/Fraud Watch Network. And you can see in real time how people are reporting scams. Investment scams are a huge one. You see it particularly in Southeast Florida, down where you are, quite frankly. But you also see it all around the state. And some of that has to do with the demographics of our population. We have a lot of people who retired down here. So people who are older, but also people who the scammers know have resources that are worth trying to swindle away. I got to tell you, I think that one of the things that I would say for your audience in particular is that we have a model in mind of the victim as somebody who's probably the little old lady, the proverbial little old lady who's alone in her home and easily duped. We did some work a few years ago with FINRA who said, while that may be true for some, there are a lot of guys like you and me, 40s, 50s, 60s, feel like we have an idea of what a smart investment is, who get scammed on a regular basis because we're a little too confident in our own abilities and we don't do the due diligence to make sure that who we're dealing with is on the up and up.
True. And men specifically make themselves targets because of that extra macho confidence. Okay, what are some of the rules of thumb? What are some of the things that you tell people to do to protect themselves from letting that scammer into your life?
I would say a couple of things. First of all, always be wary of somebody who cold calls you, of the letter in the mail that looks super official but doesn't actually have a return address on it, of the phone call that comes through the door that claims to be somebody that you're not sure about, even of email that may look like it's from your bank. Usually those unsolicited things are efforts to try to get your personal information, whether it be your identity, like your social security number, or your bank account information so that they can go straight to your finances. And in all of those cases, it just makes sense to say, I'll call you back. I'll contact you back. I'll look up the information on my bank's card or on my credit card. I'll look up your information online and then I'll get back to you, because then you put in your own hands the ability to check out whether somebody is who they say they are.
So if you were scammed or you're the potential victim of a scam, but maybe you stopped it in time, 45 seconds. How do you fight back against these situations? What do you tell people?
Best thing you can do is to call the AARP Fraud Watch Network. It's 877-908-3360. It helps us record where the big scams are, and it also helps us educate others, because most of us, if we have heard of a scam somewhere else, we are far less likely to fall for that same scam. So you can really help your fellow citizens by raising the alarm and letting other people know what somebody tried to do to you.
Give us that phone number one more time, please.
It's 877-908-3360.
Good advice. Great advice, Jeff. Thanks so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again for having me.
And you stay with us too. We'll be back here in a moment. Coming up on The Income Generation. We'll be right back.
The road to retirement is filled with twists and turns, and life's unexpected detours could easily throw you off course. That's why it's essential to work with a financial advisor who is also a fiduciary experienced in helping clients navigate the complexities of retirement planning while helping you pay yourself first. The road to retirement now made simple. To learn more, visit theretirementinComeStore.com.
One thing that all scam artists seem to have in common is that their success depends on their victims believing in something that isn't real. They create illusions, and sometimes very convincing ones. The illusion that the government needs your personal information in order to protect you, for example. Or the illusion that you must pay a fine immediately in order to avoid further penalty. Or even that you need to act right away in order to take advantage of a can't-miss investment opportunity. And illusion is actually a fitting theme for this week's market update portion of the show. Why? Because, as I've noted many times, much of what we're seeing in the financial markets these days, I believe, is largely an illusion. And that includes the stock market, which is most likely in a classic blow-off top right now based upon artificial influences instead of economic realities. As I'm sure you know, Wall Street has shown some telling signs of nervousness in recent weeks, especially as the coronavirus outbreak is spread across portions of the world, and Bernie Sanders has moved up the Democratic polls. The threat of a global pandemic is just the kind of thing that can emerge as a tipping point for a major sustained market correction. especially during a blow-off top period. In addition to fears of a pandemic, several other factors could also be driving the market's recent volatility. For example, at its most recent meeting, the Federal Reserve forecast that it will maintain the Fed funds rate in its current range of 1.5% to 1.75%, hopefully through 2021. Well, that could be a challenge since long-term interest rates have been holding in a range that's lower than that. They've been between 1.5% to 6% and very recently have actually gone below 1.3. Long-term rates falling below short-term rates have once again created an inverted yield curve, a situation that occurred last year that forced the Fed to start lowering short-term rates after raising them throughout 2019. And as you might recall, an inverted yield curve is not only a recession warning sign, it has the potential to help trigger a recession. Why? Because it creates disincentive for banks and other lending institutions to actually approve loans. That can affect things like the housing market, business startups, and have a ripple effect that undercuts more positive economic factors such as job growth and consumer spending. And as I noted last week, the fact that the yield on the 10-year Treasury rate has fallen this far, it's gotten below 1.3 at one point, is a sure sign that the bond market disagrees more strongly than ever before with Wall Street, that the economy is strong enough to justify sky-high stock prices. In other words, like any other blow-off top, the one happening in today's stock market is most likely an illusion. And at any time, the froth could spill over and segue into the next major sustained correction. As I noted in my 2020 market forecast show, the most important questions for investors over the age of 50 to ask, if this blow-off top period should continue, are the same questions you should ask when you suspect you're being scammed. Is this real? And if not, do I really want to bet on something that's probably artificial? Now, let's get to that fun time of the show and take some of your questions and comments. Our first comment is from Steve. And Steve writes, how do I get a safe income stream when interest rates are so low? So Steve, thank you for your question. And I guess it depends how you define the word safe, because safe is only a word and means different things to different people. It's amazing how many brokers will be talking to a client saying you have a conservative portfolio, you have conservative stocks, when stocks, as we all know, really aren't conservative in the first place. So the word safe and conservative means different things to different people. So if you say safe, as in government bond safe or bank CD, FDIC insured safe, then the real answer is you can't. It's hard to get competitive interest. The best you could do with some item that's actually insured by a governmental fund or entity might be a fixed annuity, and you might be able to get 2 or 3% instead of 1 or 2. But if you're saying safe as conservative, being much more conservative than the stock market, understanding that maybe there's a little bit of default risk, such as corporate bonds and bond-like instruments, investment-grade bonds, now all of a sudden you can start to get more yield. And depending upon your risk tolerance, you can actually get yields up to 5% or more in income and dividends. And I don't mean total return. I don't mean crossing your fingers and toes hoping for growth. I mean literally interest and dividends. So again, it depends upon how much risk you want to take. Remember, all the things we're talking about are generally considered to be more conservative than the stock market because you're not hoping for growth, you're investing for income. Next, we have Lewis. And Lewis says, you know, my question is, I'm 5 years away from retirement. My funds are in a 403B plan. How can an income specialist benefit me? Well, the answer is it may or may not, depending upon which type of 403B you have. Some 403Bs, particularly those for teachers, have a triggering event where if you're over a certain age, typically 59 and a half, you can roll that 403B over to an IRA. And now you can get into all the income type options you want. Unfortunately, 403Bs are limited to mutual funds. They're limited to things that are more growth-oriented as a general rule. Why? Because the 403B there is to attract workers in their 20s and 30s. You know, let's face it, most employers don't hire people in their 50s and 60s. They're hiring people in their 30s, 20s or 30s or even 40s. Those people want growth-oriented alternatives, mutual funds. And that's why I believe most 403Bs have almost exclusively mutual funds inside of them. So bottom line is if you're let's say a teacher, and you have a triggering age at which you're able to roll that 403B over to an IRA, now the universe of income generating options becomes available to you. And then finding an income specialist can benefit you. However, if you're in a 403B plan, a lot of times with large hospitals, a lot of times those plans don't allow these in-service rollovers till you actually leave your employment, no matter how old you are. So there's no magical age at which you can make an in-service rollover from the 403B to an IRA. So the real answer is, depending upon the constraints or the flexibility of your 403B, you may or may not be able to benefit from an income specialist at this time. And finally, we have Andrew, who writes, I'm currently living in Michigan. I'm about a year away from retiring. I do plan to move to Mississippi when I retire. Andrew, I guess you don't like the cold weather. I currently have a financial advisor, but want to connect with an advisor who will focus on income so I can travel during my retirement. How do I do this? Well, first of all, Andrew, don't be too quick to assume that your advisor in Michigan isn't an income specialist. He may or may not be. Now, you might be writing this because you have all your money in stocks or mutual funds under his management, and you may be pretty sure that he's not an income specialist. But by interviewing and asking him, you can tell by simply asking him what percentage of his clients are retired versus still working. Maybe asking him, of those percentage that are actually retired, what's a typical allocation between stocks and bonds? And then you might want to ask him, on the bond side, does he tend to use bond mutual funds and ETFs or individual bonds? Because if he says he works with older folks that are retired, a lot of his clients are retired. If he says that his typical allocation for those is more in bonds and bond-like instruments than in stocks, and if he says he uses individual bonds instead of bond funds or ETFs, those are all good signs. However, if he answers any of the other questions the opposite, or especially if he answers all the questions the opposite, right? That most of his people are still working, they have most of their money in the stock market, and he uses bond funds or ETFs over individual bonds, then you've confirmed that he's not an income specialist. And it's not essential you find an income specialist in Mississippi, by the way. Today's day and age, you can get income specialists anywhere around the country with technology that can work with you and can help you achieve your goals. So how do you do it? You interview people and you ask them the questions I just gave you. Or if you want to come to our website, you can look to try to find an income specialist in your area if you'd like. But generally speaking, by interviewing any financial advisor and giving him those and asking him some of those questions I just gave you, that'll really give you some good insight. So thanks to all of you who wrote in with your questions and comments. And don't forget, you can reach out to us as well via telephone or email, and you might hear your question answered right here on The Income Generation. We'll be back right after the break. Did you know that the Retirement Income Store publishes its own newsletter? Each month, we share helpful information, research reports, and other resources to help you navigate the complexities of planning and saving for retirement. And for a limited time, we're offering a 3-month trial subscription to the Retirement Income Store newsletter. Visit theretirementincomestore.com to learn more. As I mentioned a few times, scam artists frequently target older victims. Why? Because they know that these people are more likely to result in a bigger payoff. In other words, retirees and near retirees are more likely to have accumulated a larger and more diverse pool of assets that they can steal. The good news for those of us with some gray hairs about scammers is that we've also had time to accumulate more experience and wisdom, which hopefully has sharpened our ability to recognize a phony sales pitch when we hear one. We're less likely to ignore our protective instincts when something simply doesn't pass the sniff test. And that's good. But sometimes even smart, sensible people with tons of experience can end up making poor choices because of the two fundamental emotions that drive most financial decisions. They are fear and greed. If you're a regular viewer, I'm sure you've heard me discuss this before as it relates to investing. Most people are not hardwired to be good investors. Why? Because it requires being able to override those basic emotions on a regular basis. It means being able to buy when the market is low and being driven by fear, and being able to sell when the market is high and going up and being driven by greed. For most people, their own greed impulse kicks in during a high market and they want to stay put. And when I say greed, I simply mean the innate urge to keep on making money while the money's there to be made. However, their fear impulse kicks in when the market enters a sustained correction. And that's when they finally pull out. That's why buy low, sell high is a simple principle. But it's not easy to implement in practice because it runs against human nature. Those same instincts and emotions are what make us all potentially vulnerable to financial scams, regardless of our age, experience, or ability to sniff out deception. Keep this in mind as you ponder the questions I mentioned earlier about today's stock market. Is it real? And if not, do I really want to bet on something that's artificial? Because in my experience, most logical people already do recognize that the market is fundamentally out of whack with reality in many ways, and they've wisely taken steps to reduce their market risk. You who haven't may simply be letting your emotions override your logic, which again is human nature. I get it. The good news is that even with the latest bouts of extreme volatility in the stock market, there is still time to reduce your risk by switching your focus from growth to income before the next major sustained correction takes hold. That, of course, is easier than ever today thanks to our very own Retirement Income Store, a resource that helps investors nationwide easily find a financial advisor who specializes in financial strategies geared toward portfolio protection and consistent income. Now it's time to welcome my good friend, Michael Eastham, founder of Fellowship Financial Group, a retirement income store based just outside of Orlando, Florida. He's also Amazon's best-selling author of Common Sense Income Strategies. Michael, thanks so much for being here on the show today.
It's always a pleasure, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Hey, so have you had clients that you recall who personally, sadly, got scammed by scammers over the telephone or in the mail that you could recall?
You know, there are a couple of things that we've seen in terms of the scams. One has been through the IRS. So a lot of folks have gotten their identity stolen through the IRS. So as a result, you know, they end up having to file paper instead of doing electronically. We've had a couple of attempts, but fortunately, most of our clients are educated in that regard because there's so many things that are going on.
So with the IRS, they weren't really being scammed. Essentially, the IRS got scammed because somehow the return got hacked, and now you have to put a special, I guess, 4-digit number,
like
6-digit number there. I know I have to do that on my return too, or they won't accept it. And usually, isn't that usually where somebody tries to get in and tries to claim a refund before you've actually filed? Isn't that the most typical strategy?
It is actually, yeah.
Of course, if the IRS does send the check to the scammer and then you file subsequently, they still have to give you your refund if you're owed, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot longer. You know, there's a lot more paperwork that's involved, and nobody likes to deal with the IRS. So it's a big hassle.
Absolutely. So 45 seconds in this segment here. You know, so if you had a good track record with your clients not being scammed with IRS or Social Security telephone scams, what do you tell your clients to help them so they can keep their guard up and be protected?
Well, look, I mean, you're dealing with seniors, baby boomers. A lot of them tend not to be so tech savvy, and a lot of them are too trusting. That's like a perfect storm. So I tell people all the time, question everything. Don't be afraid to ask questions, because these scammers are becoming very, very sophisticated. I mean, they're changing all the time, and you've got to be on the alert for them. I mean, you might get a phone call where the caller ID shows up as your bank, and the phone number that shows up is your bank's phone number. So you may not be suspect of that. And that's where you have to ask questions. Question everything.
They can be convincing. They can be very convincing. Michael, stay with us. We need to take a quick commercial break. You stay with us too. We'll be right back here with more from Michael Eastham on the Income Generation. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Income Generation. I'm here with my good friend, Michael Eastham, Amazon best-selling author and founder of Fellowship Financial Group, a retirement income store located just outside of Orlando, Florida. Michael, thanks for sticking around.
My pleasure, Dave.
So what do you think, we were talking about it a little bit before the break, and we had to close up really quick for the commercial, but what do you think really is it personally, emotionally, within someone that, I know you said trusting, but that allows them potentially to be victimized by some of these scammers?
Well, I think what has to happen is they do need to question everything. Don't, just because you think something seems secure, that doesn't necessarily mean it's secure. So especially if you're getting online and doing transactions, well, you need to make sure that if you have to have a password, it's a fairly complex password that can't be hacked that easily. Also, if you're on a website, you want to make sure that the website is secure, and that's pretty easy to do. You look in the top left-hand corner, if it says HTTPS, not just HTTP, the S stands for secure. That's a good thing. And then finally, you want to make sure that if you're sending money somewhere, that you're using a trusted online payment processor, like, for example, PayPal or Apple Wallet. All have been tried and tested and have good ways to protect purchases for individuals and consumers.
HTTPS. I just learned something from you. I didn't actually know that. Of course, I'm not very tech savvy, so it's certainly worth the price of admission for me here. We have a minute and a half left then. Outside then of the realm of scams, given, what we saw the stock market do just over the last few weeks, some real struggles with the coronavirus and other factors, what's the best advice you have for our viewers, income generation members? Maybe not from getting scammed, but just from getting the raw end of the deal, if you will, with their investments and with their retirement strategies?
Well, one of the things that we talk to our clients about quite a bit, I wrote about it in Common Sense Income Strategies as well, is just making sure that the money you need for income in retirement, that you're generating income from your investments. So you've got those assets allocated towards vehicles and instruments that are designed to pay interest and dividends and predictable income streams. If you've got that income covered from pensions and this type of income, and you still have discretionary assets, well, then you can take a little bit more risk if you're comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm. Or you can just generate more income and use the income for gifting to loved ones, for giving to your church or other charities, or just reinvesting to buy more shares. One thing, I don't know about you, but the one thing I've never heard is a client complain that they had too much income, except for April 15th maybe. So, Michael, thanks so much for being with us again on the show. I really appreciate you being back. And you stay with us too. We have more coming up in a moment right here on the Income Generation. We'll be right back. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us today for another episode of The Income Generation. I'd also like to thank you, our new and returning viewers. As the recent surge in Social Security as well as other scams continues, remember to stay vigilant against scammers, no matter how legitimate they may seem, or what kind of proof they may seem to offer. Remember that the Social Security Administration will never threaten you with arrest or with legal action. Promise a service in exchange for payment, or request a payment by cash, gift card, debit card, wire transfer, or internet currency. And they will also never send official letters or reports to you via email. If you should get a call asking for your Social Security number or other personal information, it's best to hang up. You may want to report the call to your local authorities, again, the Office of Inspector General, Social Security Administration, or the Federal Trade Commission. But remember, too, that as you near and enter retirement, your chances of being victimized by scam artists increases exponentially. So it's important to stay on the lookout for other types of scams. Some of the most common include investment scams, telemarketing scams, Medicare and health insurance scams, homeowners and reverse mortgage scams. And finally, keep in mind that the emotions and instincts that make us all potentially vulnerable to financial schemes and scams are the same ones that may jeopardize your retirement in other ways. Most people aren't naturally wired to be good investors. Why? Because it often means overriding these basic instincts and emotions. Many people do recognize logically that today's stock market is in a classic blow-off top and ultimately an illusion and a vulnerable one, as evidenced by the latest bouts of extreme volatility. However, they may not yet have taken steps to lower the risk. Why? Because perhaps you're still being ruled more by emotion than by logic, much like the stock market itself. Ultimately, the most important thing to remember is that once you're retired or within 10 years of retirement, I believe your top financial priority should be overprotection. That means overprotection from the risk of financial scams, the risk of inflation, the risk of spending down principal, and the risk of a major sustained market correction. And as you certainly already know if you're a regular viewer, the key to ensuring protection against most of these risks starts by switching your strategic focus from growth to income. Thanks for watching. If you're close to retirement, you really want to know how to try to maximize your money, it's essential you stay informed and up to date, and right here is where you can do it on the Income Generation. I'm David Scranton, and we'll see you next week.